Yeah, we can see.
Great. So one of the big things that I've gotten into after graduation is doing medieval music. And I play with some folks and I play like instruments, and it's a great deal of fun, but it's really different from post-Bach, because Bach really changed how people were, his contemporaries really changed how we think about music. So I wanted to go and look for an earlier composer. And this is a little challenging because we have fewer composers in general in the past, and especially fewer women. The sort of racial lines are a little blurry in the past as well, so that's harder to search for. So I picked this composer, Maddalena Casulana, who has some published works that we can talk about and hear. We don't have any photos of her. We have some biographical information. She was born in 1540 and probably in Florence. By the 1560s, she's publishing some stuff in Venice, teaching composing, playing lute a bit. And then by 1580 or so, she stopped doing work that we have records for, probably because she got married. We don't really know. Biographical details are a little scarce. That's sort of most of what we've got. But because she's published in print, she is the first known female composer in print, although not the first female composer by a mile. I mean, you can look at Hildegard von Bingen, writing in the 12th century, who was very prolific as well, among others. Her work is really unusual, and we'll get into details on all of this in a little bit, because she's writing in this time when it's not expected that women do this kind of work, especially outside of a couple of fixed roles. So she's published widely, which is unusual. Her work is directly challenging some of these societal notions of male supremacy in these roles, especially in composition. But she's not working for a fixed patron. She's not like, some person's personal composer. She's not a courtesan. She's not of noble birth, and she's not a nun, which are the typical ways that women got into these roles otherwise, because they had to have some other kind of angle, like, oh, well, I'm really rich and I can just do whatever I want. Or Hildegard von Bingen, for example, was a religious figure. So she's really interesting because she's none of these things that we would expect to give her this leg up, to enter this space. Her body of work is a few dozen madrigals, and I've got a part page from one of them over here, so you can sort of see what they look like when they were published. Madrigals is this big genre at this time. They started out as chamber music in the early 1500s, sort of modeling courtly conversation and wit with allegory and riposte and some sexual allegories, generally being sung by members of the court as sort of entertainment for themselves. But by the second half of the century, when she's writing, they'd shifted from being this amateur performance to being professional, an amateur performed by male court members, to being generally sung by professional women singing groups being hired by the court. And the content of the madrigals has shifted to be a lot more sexually explicit. And so this reversal of gender role makes that contrast even higher, especially because madrigals tend to be at least an allegory for sort of the male perspective on sex. So being sung by women is really interesting and really sort of scandalous. And this sort of provided this arena for flirting and speaking about sex in this court environment that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. But mediated by the music, it contains this tension. It lets you relieve it in a socially appropriate manner. Casulana's work is really interesting because it navigates the social expectations for these songs, and also for her being a woman, and she tries to strike this delicate balance between sort of being overly sexualized as a female body and being overly masculine, sort of disembodied mind. And this is the conceptual distinction that people are making at the time, is that women are, the body is feminine and the mind is masculine. And that's why composition and inherently mental activity is inherently male in this worldview. Castellano's work is published generally in part books. We don't see scores, but they're 4 parts, so they're not super crazy to look at these things more all at once. There's a couple unusual things that I want to point out that's common if you start looking at early music. There's no bar lines. The clef is weird. That is a C clef on the lowest line. The cut time looks familiar, right? There's also this thing that I really wish we still had in music, where there's a little squiggle on the end of each line, and that tells you what the note on the next line is, which is really cool. I wish we had that. So if you're scanning along and you're trying to read a couple beats ahead, this helps you make the bar line jump. And that's just standard for this period of music. And yeah, there's norms around like what gets the beat. So like this is probably beating whole notes, maybe half notes. But otherwise, you know, the symbols are more or less the same. They're just drawn a little differently. Except for this last note, which is a longa, which is like typically 4 whole notes, I think, in length. It's a note that you don't see in modern music. So a little bit of background to explain this more, to understand humoral theory, because it shows up in the music. I was talking about, you know, the body being inherently feminine and the mind being inherently masculine. There's also this concept of humors, and this plays into the music as well. And this is like people's understanding of the world. So this isn't just an idle, oh, medical theory, but this is how people are actually approaching this stuff. So there's this notion of 4 humors: hot, cold, wet, and dry. And there's also like 4 body fluids that correspond to these. Women are cold in this conception, and men are hot. And this makes, there's a requirement for like sex acts for the women to get warmed up in this notion and become masculinized to a certain extent for this to happen. And this sort of link of humors, which is what you're composed of, to the body fluids, is also why there's partly the reason why there's this link the music explores a lot between sexual climax and death, because they both expel a vital spirit, so to speak, which is your breath or your soul when you die, or the more obvious one during sex, linking these concepts philosophically as well as in innuendo, which these works are full of. And I said that she's directly challenging sort of male dominance in these domains. And she comes out and says this. So this is the dedication to her first publication, which is dedicated to her patron, who's Isabella de Medici. So she's choosing a female patron, which is interesting. And she comes out and says this, right? She said, "I would like to show also to the world the conceited error of men. They believe so strongly to be the masters of the high gifts of the intellect that in their opinion, these gifts cannot likewise be shared by women." And so she's coming out with her first published work saying like, "I'm as good as the rest of you, and I'm going to show it to you through my music." Generally in her work, she's downplaying the point of musical climax, which for these songs that are sometimes explicitly simulating sex acts is really different. She denies the male musical climax, as one commentator put it. She emphasizes passages of togetherness or unity between the sexes. And like others in this genre, she's using a technique called word painting, which is like where the melody of each line, the shape of it mimics the wording. So you say, I will climb a mountain, right? You go up when there's a thing that goes up. And it's kind of cheesy from our modern perspective, but it was a big deal at the time. But there's less climax in her work and generally more extended sort of musical foreplay. So because you probably haven't heard a lot of madrigals, I'm going to play a snippet of a contemporary male composer, John Downland, who's from England. And like this is fairly straightforward. Now, I don't know if the sound is going to work directly, so let me know if you can hear this. Can you hear it?
No, can't hear it.
Then I will do the screen share a different way. I think I have to share my whole desktop, right?
I think there's a box in the bottom when you screen share that you have to share the computer sound.
Okay. Apologies. I'm trying to find the. I am not finding it.
So come out of the screen sharing. And then when you screen share, it says share sound and optimize for video clip. So click both those boxes in the lower left-hand corner.
I am not seeing this. It might be because I'm using WebZoom because that's the hardware I have.
Oh.
My apologies then. That's really frustrating.
Well, why don't you send me the link and I'll
yes.
chat and I'll share it.
I will put it in the chat. And I will attempt to find YouTube videos for the other two because the other ones are from YouTube Music.
Okay. So
I only want to play the first verse of this.
Okay.
So that's sort of the structure of these things, right? You got 4-part harmony, and you can see that it builds this piece built to this really clear tension and climax, and then releases it. And this is a fairly explicit sexual allegory here. So
another link.
Yes. So the next link is this song by Castellana. Come on. And I'm going to briefly talk about it while it's being loaded up. So the lyrics of this are, "My heart cannot die, I would like to kill it, since that would please you. But it cannot be pulled out of your breast, where it has been dwelling for a long time. And if I killed it as I wish, I know that you would die, and I would die too." So I think it's really interesting that we get this big buildup and we don't get a climax. And we do it again and you still don't get it. And that's a big difference from a lot of the other composers. This is, evading cadences is what she's doing. She does it in a lot of her work. There's also this counterplay between homophony and imbrication and overlapping half-step movements. And this is trying to emphasize this contrast between longing to die and to remain united. The next piece, and I'm going to show, this next piece is a conversation between two different, between Death and the speaker. I'll put the link in the chat. This is the last one I'm going to do too. So this is sort of saying, "Death, what do you wish? I call you, behold, for I draw near. Take me and complete all that remains of my sorrow. I cannot. You cannot do so. Why?" This next section repeats. "Because in you the heart does not reign. Yes, it does. No, it does not. Make the return, because those without life cannot die." So the conceit here is, right, death is sexual climax, and the music is sort of replicating that encounter. And male audiences would expect it to climax, but we're getting more of at least what Castellano thinks is a feminine perspective on this. But there's a second layer that this is also a philosophical discussion, because sex and death are the same process philosophically. So there's this tension between, well, why do we desire one but fear the other? And there's this interplay there going on, which I think is really cool. We also have some humoral stuff going on. Because in you the heart does not rain, that's this, again, notion that women have to be warmed up. The heart is hot. So let me get back to sharing, and I just have another brief slide. So what did Castellano mean by high gifts of the intellect? Is this visible?
Yep.
Okay, that shows me nothing. So she avoided feminizing her music in the way that a lot of her contemporaries did. So it seems that there was this mold of female composers who existed at the time, who generally wrote laments, that kind of song about, I'm unlucky in love, or my husband died, or something like that. And she's not writing that. Her topics are more thoughtful and more philosophical, which is an interesting distinction. And she's setting out to engage and challenge male society, as well as dealing with the expectation at the time that if a woman is speaking up and entering male society, there was this belief that, well, she's just doing it to get sex and attention. And she's coming out and saying, no, I'm here to play in the same playing field and to do all the same things you're doing. And so she's showing her gifts in the conceitedness of men by outdoing them in content. She's not just writing songs that are just sort of shallow imitations of sex acts, but she's writing about philosophy and tension and love, as well as writing about shallow imitations of sex acts. So I thought this was a really interesting composer, sort of doing stuff before a lot of the later composers that bring in what looks like feminism to something really early. Thanks, folks.
Great, wonderful presentation. So questions from our class for Alec.
How did you come upon this composer?
It's a little lame. So I looked in the orchestra database and I was like, they don't go back before like 1700 or whatever. And that's sort of the cutoff point for when a lot of real music stuff is. So I actually just went on Wikipedia and looked at lists of female composers and went through like 30 of them, because the early ones, there's actually a lot of known women madrigals, but listed under composers because they probably did compose, but we don't have any of their works. So we just have like, oh, this person showed up in a list of performers at some dude's court, and that's not enough for this presentation. So this was one of the earlier ones that had a lot of work, and the more I read about it, and I found this master's thesis about her work that was just fascinating. And I was like, all right, I have to do this as long as Chris is okay with the content. And actually, I'm gonna bring this stuff to my music groups and be like, we have to do some of these songs. These are amazing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And so at Cornell, the women's choir have done a lot of women's chorus, have these commissioning series where they try to commission women composers who are really in that same spirit of not writing sort of feminine works, right? So, because I think many sort of stereotypical image of a women composer, like I think, so Fanny Mendelssohn, Clara Schumann, they had to write, they were sort of pigeonholed into writing solo piano music. They were never encouraged to write concertos or symphonies or things that were considered more masculine domain of music. Even composers, women composers who were allowed to sort of pursue the craft of composition, then they were sort of expected to sort of stay within a certain kind of medium within music. So I think the Women's Chorus commissioning project was meant to encourage women composers to write not in a feminine way, but whatever way they want to express themselves. Yeah. So I think you kind of hit upon this sort of maverick figure who went against sort of social norms of her time, right? And I think women composers have always had to go against that, right? So, I mean, Ruth Crawford Seeger, um, uh, basically her composition career kind of fizzled away once she got married. And then her work basically changed to sort of collecting folk songs because her husband was such a big figure in the folk song sort of arena. So rather than pursue her own very abrasive, no bars hold contemporary music sort of style, she decided to sort of pursue collecting folk songs, right? So, and there are countless examples of that kind of situation. I mean, even, you know, I think Lily Boulanger's music survived basically because her oldest sister, Nadia Boulanger, just championed her music for the rest of her, for Nadia Boulanger's life. And so Lily Boulanger died quite young. And so Nadia, the older sister, took it on as her mission to basically anywhere she went to perform as a conductor, she would program her younger sister's work. And she was a huge proponent. And that's pretty much the only reason we know of the Lily Boulanger now, right? And in our time, she really didn't. She had the renown. She was, you know, being heralded as a really talented, promising composer. But the establishment just didn't really want to accept her. All right. If Lily had been a male, she would have been basically lifted up by the entire French musical establishment as this is our own, because in Lily's time there was all these nationalist movements of each country. So it was very important for each musical circles in Poland, in France, in Germany to kind of lift up their own composers. But they in France they struck down the efforts of women composers like Lily Boulanger, like Louis Farrenc. Louis Farrenc was the first dean of the French Conservatory in Paris, and in fact, her male counterparts were so jealous of her, they would put together concerts of her music and then hired bad musicians to sabotage the concert and then prove, see, it sounds terrible, and this kind of thing. So, and a lot of our work they don't survive because the male composers actively try to destroy her manuscripts. So it's just really kind of a shameful treatment of women composers that we have witnessed. One of the projects the Women's Society, Philharmonic Society in the Bay Area, they do is they advocate for championing performances of women composers' works, but also in preparing manuscripts that are quite difficult to read in performance editions. So I along with like I think another 15 or 20 editors, we're all sort of conductors who are volunteering their time to inputting Louis Farrenc's and along with a whole bunch of other women composers into Sibelius and Finale, where it can be actually read by an orchestra without trying to decipher this handwritten, because some women have really a beautiful handwriting. Clara Schumann had beautiful handwriting, but then there are composers like Louis Farrenc where you're like, what note is that? So like there's a passage I'm trying to work through right now, and I have no idea what the notes are because I cannot tell what the notes are. So so I'm basically kind of doing detective work in terms of comparing that particular passage when it occurs earlier in the movement, and rather trying to decide, okay, is it the same or is it different the second time, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of advocacy work that's needed. And so the Women's Philharmonic has been really instrumental in bringing these manuscripts so that they are easily performable by orchestras. Because one of the things orchestras have said, we can't spend the time to produce a performing edition because we can't read that. But now there's many performing editions where it's been lovingly inputted into Sibelius, into a legible form by volunteers. There are starting to be a whole library of works that are available. So the Free Library of Philadelphia have been sort of cataloging these pieces are readily available for orchestras. So I'll send a link to that. So if you have community orchestras or school groups and youth orchestras that say, oh, it's always going to be all rental and very expensive. Actually, it's free. And you just have to pay for shipping. So the Free Library of Philadelphia has literally, I think, I'll send you the link to the catalog, but it has like 200 works by women composers that have been inputted into this form. So they work together with the Women's Philharmonic Society. I think what I learned from many sources was that I constantly ran into these excuses that people were making, whether it be an all-state orchestra saying, oh, high schools can't afford to buy pieces or rent pieces individually. But in fact, there's a lot of resources that are out there. But when I meet conductors, young conductors, they're simply, the first layers, they don't know it's a problem, right? So they're kind of trying to learn their craft of just learning how to conduct the fermata in a Beethoven symphony. So one, they're not really aware of the repertoire sort of restrictive problem. And then two, once they get to that stage of, okay, I want to explore, that they don't quite know all the resources to go to. Or there might be a music director of a small orchestra or a high school orchestra or youth orchestra. And then they're sort of faced with this, where do I procure these parts problem, right? So one of the things that Rob Deemer at the Diversity Composer Database is trying to have is not only who are the composers and sort of the biographical background, but, and as you have seen in your research projects, in fact, it's kind of difficult to find these composers, right? Because none of the established databases actually have them, right? So just getting those names in the database themselves is an issue right now. So David Daniels has this, he was sort of a grand poobah of repertoire, right? Where all the conductors went to the orchestral database and figured out what the instrumentation was, like but there was an inherent sort of judgment in that document because it wouldn't have the complete works of Berlioz. It would sort of have like 15, right? So the inference is that that's the most performed works, those are the works by Berlioz that should be performed, right? So if you don't see a women composer or a BIPOC composer, then the inference is, the assumption is they're not worth pursuing. And in fact, that's the line most conducting pedagogues have sort of like went with, rather than actually exploring a work by Lily Boulanger and see if it's what the musical content is, right? But just by saying, well, it's not in the Daniels book, so it must not be, time has sifted them out, that kind of argument, right? Well, okay, but the problem is there have been structural discrimination against women composers and BIPOC composers by not including them in these references, journals, and databases. So I think there is really much needed scholarship work in including the women composers, the BIPOC composers, into the databases, into the journals, into the books that are used to teach classical music and orchestral music to young conductors, young musicians, right? So, I love these composers you have brought to our attention and bringing about more awareness of them. So please keep doing that, right? So please try to influence those around you and nudge them. Like, hey, do you know about Grazina Bacovic? And if you're a violinist and you don't know who that is, a fantastic Polish virtuoso who, and basically anytime I meet a violinist, especially a female violinist, I say, you should know her music. And then they go and like explore her music, and they always come back to me and says, I'm going to put together a recital of her music because she's amazing. So, and I've always been amazed by the quality and quality of the music that we as a field have ignored and dismissed, right? It'll be based on all the things I was told, right? Based on all the attitudes by the older generation about female composers, about BIPOC composers. What I expected to find when I actually went to do a deep dive and explore their music, what I expected to find was mediocrity. Somehow the music didn't quite come up to the standard of all these different, the Western canon, Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven. But what I found actually was, in fact, a case in which, why didn't anybody let me know about this composer, this woman composer? Because the quality was of such that it just felt unjust to ignore these composers. I'll put her name in the chat. Grazina Basavich. Whoops. Okay. At Cornell, we did her string orchestra piece called Concerto for Strings, and it is hard and it sounds hard, but it's so idiomatically written for the strings. After the students figured out the bowing and the fingering, they were like, you know, this actually falls, this is hard, but there's nothing that's like weirdly unidiomatic. Everything lies so well on your fingers. And the students really enjoy digging into that piece. So there are composers like this that have been marginalized and ignored for such a long time. And I think as a musician, we should always be trying to find composers to advocate for, right? There should always be the sense of discovering a composer that is not known, right? That is not, that doesn't have the name recognition that Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Mahler, Shostakovich does, right? Okay, all right, let's turn our discussion with the time left to a couple things. One of the challenges in this time of pandemic, of course, is trying to figure out how to navigate being able to do things in person when we can't do things in person, right? So I've tried to do them in different ear training exercises. I've tried to have more on-screen analysis of pieces, but I don't really want to toss out the conducting portion. So I'm actually curious to hear everybody's opinion on the ratio of activity, how it was so far in this course, what felt like it was given too much time, what felt like it was given not enough time. So I'm curious to hear your reactions to many different portions, the ear training portion, the analysis portion, the conducting videos portions, the guest speaker portion, all of it.
I guess one thing that comes to mind immediately is one thing I wish there was a little bit more of was connection of like the ear training exercises with like the music, if that makes any sense.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
I don't know how to explain it really, but like, yeah.
So I mean, as I had pointed out in numerous times, uh, the ear training exercises, whether it be solfege or the dichord identification or the tracking, they're all designed to, and in fact, what I wanted to do more was actually the actual score reading exercises. Um, because score reading in a way is most analogous to conducting a group and tracking what's happening with the group with a piece of music, right? But they're all supposed to be a microcosm of the macro of being in a rehearsal with an orchestra or with a group of people, right? So um, the skills of, you're basically practicing how to identify mistakes and log them as you go in real time, right? So that if you go through a passage of rather solfege, score reading, dichord identification, and not hesitate and stop in that moment and restart, right? So that, because if you're conducting, then you can't do that, right? If you stop, if you're conducting and something happens and then you go back, right, even for a half a second, then you've basically stopped conducting and not allowing the flow of music to happen, right? So we've all been in rehearsal where the conductor does that, right? Every time there's something, he or she stops. And after a while, you haven't gone past 4 bars of music in 35 minutes. And you just kind of pulling your hair out as a player going, for God's sake, at least finish a musical phrase, like one 8-bar phrase, right? So our ability to go through a musical phrase, a period of time, and then be able to track all the things that happen. So you're rehearsing in a very efficient manner, right? All of that cannot happen if you don't practice having ability to observe and compare the music that should be happening as it is in the score, right? And then comparing what the ensemble is doing, and then having sort of that line of attention. Okay, even A, B, C, D happens where you need to go back and fix it, but you can do that after a period of time, right? So you're practicing that as you do the dandolo, right? Where you don't you're going along at this clip, and then okay, I'm out now. All right, and I'm back in, right? So then there's 3 notes or 4-note passage that you had trouble, so that it's clear when you are having trouble identifying a particular interval, right? Whereas the other way, which is you stop and go back, and rather than having this sort of flow, you okay, I'm gonna go back and then do it. So do this kind of very inefficient practicing, right? So in that way of hesitating, going back, it allows you to basically not know what the mistake is, because in the moment you kind of fix it, you sort of play, even if it's a shift, you don't quite hit that shift or that correct fingering, but you hesitate and figure it out. Well, you haven't figured it out because you haven't figured out how to go from that note to this note, right? Because that's wrong, or here it is, but you've never went from here to here. So that physical memory is not registered in your brain, right? So so all of the ear training exercise, score reading exercise, dandolo exercise, dichord, they're all supposed to give you that way of going through and not stopping, but being able to track what happened during that period of time. That actually is the most important skill, right? And in a way, like being able to do the dandolo better, score read better, hear the dichord better, that's all a very positive byproduct of that exercise, right? But the main task actually, and this is a thing I have to constantly remind students that I'm teaching, because they all think it's actually identifying the right dichord, that's the primary goal. And saying on the dandolo correctly, that's the primary goal. Going through the score reading passage without error as the primary goal. So you actually end up practicing and observing the wrong thing, when in fact, the most important thing is to train our brain to be able to track the different things as they happen in real time, because that's the exact skill you will need in front of an orchestra. Does that make sense? Right.
Yeah. And one thing maybe I wanted to add is, I think it's something that I see in a lot of like not just this class, but other classes I'm taking and I have taken. Like for example, when they ask you to do interval training and then they give you your training software to just do those intervals, but I don't think I've ever seen a software that gives me context, especially for example when you're doing like cadences and they just play like the two chords, but it's like how am I supposed to know if I don't have context?
Right.
So I guess it's just also a problem with, because if you're with other people and you have experience doing it, then like it's easier to do, but there's no like software you can just have by yourself and kind of do it.
Yeah,
But yeah.
that's absolutely true. And in fact, so many times music theory is taught completely divorced from music we would play, right? And it's just they pull out examples and it's like, okay, when would I see a German sixth chord? And then, so for a long time, like I went through entire existence as a musician, like I know the concept of German sixth, but no one ever points out and see, here's a German sixth, right? So the conductor would say, see, here's a German sixth, and here's an Italian sixth. But I never had that. I would only see the German sixth in sort of this taken out of context example. Okay, all right. And then I would go through, play a bunch of music that has German sixth and no one would ever point it out. And I would just go right by it, right? So I think that's in a way, I really don't like conducting textbooks that really have like these picked out examples, like conduct a four pattern. What kind of four pattern? Like, is it, no, they just give you this graph, what the pattern is supposed to look like without any context of what the musical passage that might be, right? And a four pattern can be, it's infinite number of variables, right? You could have people entering on the second end of the second beat. There's articulation changes, dynamic changes, so many variation, right? That's why I kind of view, and I think sometimes people have argued to me, yeah, but if a person is unable to conduct in four, right, like floor, window, ceiling, they don't know that, then you have to start there. It's like, no, you can start with an actual music, like actually start with a musical passage and you show everything that you need to show in that musical passage, right? Or you add one layer at a time, right? So, and I think in this course, I went with the excerpt route rather than, because 3 years ago when I taught the advanced conducting version, I just threw like real repertoire, Dvorak's Serenade, Beethoven's Second Symphony, and because we would actually get it in front of a group a week after being in the class in front of an ensemble. So you actually had to conduct that piece of music with a group. And the stress level of the class was so high that they felt like, Chris, I can do like 12 bars, but like there's no way I can prepare an entire movement in a week. Like I can't do it. So I kind of like the excerpt route we went this semester, because then it sort of prepared your way up to doing the whole Beethoven 5 symphony, first movement, rather than that was the first assignment, right? So yeah, but Rachel's point is really true. In terms of the ear training exercise, all the exercises having connection to the excerpts we will be doing, right? I think I got to figure out a better way to do that, right? Yeah. What else? Alec.
I wanted to say I really liked the sections where we'd be preparing one of the conducting exercises and you go into detail and like, okay, so at this spot, you have to make this choice. And you just one of these three options, let's practice those three options. Here's how to think about the choice and how that affects what you do with your hands. I thought that was really helpful because like when we dove into how, okay, how do we start Beethoven 5?
Right.
That felt like, okay, now I have new skills that I didn't have before.
Yeah, and so I always like to approach a score, because I used to have a teacher, this Spanish conductor, who used to do this. He used to basically say, okay, what is presto? And we're like, tempo? No. Fast tempo? No. Italian fast tempo? No. It means pianissimo. What? what does that mean? And then he would give you like 4 examples of presto by Brahms, by different composers, where that kind of thing, where it's okay. So how am I possibly supposed to read your mind about what that is? So yes, it's true, when composers use presto in a finale, it's often presented soft first and then loud, right? So, but he was presenting it in a such a dogmatic, this is what it means. Well, couldn't there be an example where a composer doesn't use presto in a pianissimo setting? So there are, but but the point was that his way of teaching a particular concept was his way or the highway, right? So, but I found that in fact, yes, okay, that might be the case. Presto might be presented as a pianissimo in a finale movement before it gets loud, but there's always a musical juncture, right, where there are like 3, 4, 5 ways of conducting that passage, right? It's about making informed choices, right? So sometimes, so for example, the fermata in the beginning of Second Symphony of Beethoven, right? So that fermata, you have basically 3 technical ways of getting out of the fermata, right? Right? Complete cutoff and then adding a beat, right? Or it's a cutoff is a downbeat, or there's no cutoff, right? Or cutoff is the next beat, right? So in places like that, you're making musical choices, and as a conductor, you have to know how to do all of those things technically, right? And so that you're not limited by, you're not making a choice default because that's the only technical way you can figure out how to do it, right? So if you're doing that fermata as cut off, add a beat, because that's the only way you can figure out how to do that fermata, you're actually changing the music in favor of technical facility, right? So there, and we're just talking technical aspects of choosing 1, 2, 3 option, right? There might be a completely musical valid way of doing 3 different ways, right? Maybe slowing, maybe you have a rubato, right? A rallentando, and you decide it's going to be a very organic slowing down into the final beat, 2, 3, and 4, or something like this. Or you might go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and where you really back end the rallentandi. Or you might do 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, where it's ritardando is front loaded, and then you kind of stay the same, right? 3 equally musically valid choices, right? Because there might be things happening in 2, 3, 4 that might justify the third way versus the second way versus the first way, right? But to say as a musician, there's only one way to do it. To say as a teacher, to say as a conductor, there's only one way to do this. I think that is a big problem. I have a problem with that way of thinking about music, right? Because I've been in enough orchestra situations, chamber music situations, where somebody sitting across me has a totally different idea, and I'm thinking, how could you think that way? But then I realize, once I have a conversation with them, oh, you know what, that makes sense, because I never thought of that option. But now that you explain it, that makes sense to me, right? But that kind of musical conversation, I'm the kind of person where I really enjoy that conversation of the difference of opinion, of difference of musical interpretation. But I've also met enough conducting teachers who are like really annoyed by that. They just want to say, just beat it in 4. Just beat the F in 4. I'm telling you to beat in 4. It's in 4. Okay. So where that discourse, they don't value that discourse. But I think you actually find out a lot more about the music from having the discourse with somebody who has a different musical opinion, right? So when I studied with Gunther Schuller, it was amazing because he was kind of a combination of 2 kinds. He had already thought about it, went through all the options, and he okay, I know what the way I do it is, okay. But instead of telling us that, he would sort of take us through each of the options, right? And give us the pro and con of each option, and then ask us to choose what we think is the right option, right? Of course, if you just chose an option because you heard it in a recording, it was like, no, that's not a way. You need to back up your musical decision with proofs, right? Evidence from the rest of the piece, why that is a logical conclusion, logical choice, right? So he actually made you fight for your option, right? So in the end, what happened was we would all fight for our option, have all kinds of musical evidence presented, and then we would realize, oh man, he already thought about all these. And yeah, actually at this point with my musical training, I can't counter his musical arguments. And so I'm going to do it his way, right? So, but the thing is, he was teaching us how to choose an option using our ability to learn the piece, learn the score, examine the score, gather evidence, right? That's why I kept saying earlier, there's a objective truth, fact that we're gathering, and then there's subjective facts, right? So if you look at a score, there are things that no one can argue with, right? It's a quarter note, it's pianissimo, it is, that's all objective sets. So you gather as much of that as possible, right? But as soon as you start thinking that's a secondary line, is it really a secondary line? Or things that are subjective, things that you could argue with another person that it could mean something different, right? So he always cautioned us in closing the window of finding out what the truth of that figure is too soon, right? If you decide too early in the process of score study, that's this, right? Then you are actually making a subjective decision based on lack of evidence. And that's when you get in trouble, right? So he's asking us to make as much gathering of data as possible objectively, right? And then once you have a set of knowledge, oh, hey, you know what? This happens like 3 times in the piece, and each time's the same except the last time, right? And that gives you much more information and ability to make a decision of how much to slow down the first time versus the third time when it's different, right? What the dynamic is. Oh, you know what? This happens 3 times. The dynamic is pianissimo the first time, and then mezzo forte the second time, and fortissimo the third time. So I better make sure it's really soft the first time, right? So these kinds of musical decisions, it'll change based on what is the context around it happens, right? So if it only happens once in the piece, okay, that's one thing. But if it happens 3 times in the piece, then you better compare the 3 times that it happens, right? I don't know how we got into that conversation, but basically the objective data gathering process should take much longer than the subjective, I'm going to decide what this is. And I always have to sort of pull myself back from making a subjective decision too fast. I fall into that trap all the time in a way, because I've experienced a lot of scores by a particular composer, and I start to see a pattern, and then I say, oh, this is this. Oh, this is Mahler doing the same thing he does again, like in his third symphony, like in the second. So by the time I get to a piece I haven't studied before, and I start to see a pattern, I jump to conclusion. I'm jumping to a subjective decision-making process. And that's the trap I have to pull myself out of. It's like, wait, we'll look at this one more time and look at the circumstance and context around what this happens. I talk too much, guys. Okay, what else? Peter.
So for me, this course was very interesting and eye-opening because I came into this with the experience in high school of having worked with like percussion ensembles, play like a pit bands, and then even like wind ensembles, where I would compose a piece that we'd play and then I'd have to conduct it. So all of my experience was just like, oh, I know exactly what this is trying to be because I made the score. Like it was my score. So I know what this is trying to be. And then it was always just trying to convey what I know the score to be to the players in the moment. And I know it was very hard to try and get any sort of that process like coming in this semester, but for me, I thoroughly enjoyed the moments where we'd go through at least, even if you would say, well, it might be the right solution, like it all depends, just knowing the different varieties that you have at your disposal was just very eye-opening. And I think if I would to take the course again, if you're looking for in the future, I think just getting to know more of those. Oh, hey, if you are in a situation like this, here is a tool you can use if you're in a slower or a more staccato, or just opening up that toolbox a little bit more, not necessarily defining like this is what you have to do, but just giving access for more tools that are out there. Because I know that that was definitely something that I realized early on was, wow, I am a lazy conductor. I have my small things that I do, and that is all I know.
Yeah, I think so. There are two things I would say in terms of composer conductors, right? Because you could argue that composers know exactly what they want, and then so they are able to make really great decisions about how to conduct that passage. Unfortunately, I've seen too many composers who can't actually execute technically what they want on the page, right? So they end up modifying the musical idea to something that can execute technically in their conducting. And I've just seen that way too many times. Like John Adams, who's a great composer, and he's not as great a conductor. So, and I spent like a whole week with him when he was conducting the St. Louis Symphony, and he kept telling me, Chris, how would you conduct this? And I'm like, why are you asking me? Like, you're the composer of this piece. Like, I'm not a conductor. Like, to show me how you would do that. I'm like, oh, okay, I like that. And then he would try to do it, and then it's like he would come back after the rehearsal, like, show me that again. I'm like, John, I don't feel comfortable teaching you how to conduct. He's like, well, it's okay. I'm just trying to figure out how to do it. And he was in a position of humility, knowing his skills, right? He was good enough of a musician to realize, you know what? I want this, but I cannot figure out how to conduct that, right? So he's in that third stage, right? Which is he's a conscious competency. So he knows when he's not hitting the marks, right? But I think sometimes there are composer conductors who are not even aware that they're actually changing the music because they can't execute it technically, right? So there's that. But in second response is, I will repeat what I said about conducting is not a ballet, right? It's always a set of tools you're pulling out depending on what the orchestra is giving you in terms of feedback. So you're always examining and listening to what the orchestra is doing. And you have to gauge, all right, this is a moment where I can let them play. I don't need to really get in there because they're functioning well without my interference or nudges, right? But then when you realize, you know what, they're off or they're late or whatever the situation is, then you pull out a different tool to give them. So we should look different from the beginning stages of a rehearsal to the final performance, right? Conductors should look different rather than, I'm always told by professional musicians, they want to see consistency. I want to know what's going to happen in that moment. And if I see something different, that's going to give me a heart attack, right? And so I saw Ozma Venska, who's the music director of the Minnesota Symphony now, really technically very proficient person, conductor. And he basically, the week I was covering him, there was a Thursday evening, Friday evening, Saturday evening performance, right? And Thursday evening performance was fantastic. And the orchestra was really happy. And then Friday, he went in and did things a little bit different, but not way out as to disturb the orchestra, right? But then Saturday, he decides he's going to do things totally differently because he felt like, okay, Friday, because admittedly Friday's performance was not as like hair-raising as Thursday in terms of excitement. I mean, it was a really great performance, but Friday was sort of like ho hum because like orchestra's seen everything, they know they can play it, so there was a sense of like we're gonna just ride this one out, right? So he felt that. So Saturday he put in a whole bunch of things where it was totally different, where the orchestra almost came apart, right? So on one hand, there were moments where it became much more exciting than Friday, but then there were moments that were so different, the orchestra panicked because they're like, oh, now you're going to be in 8 instead of 4, right? So he confused the orchestra to the point, because they were expecting a certain kind of movements, gesture in 4 and whatever, that when he did something different, the orchestra kind of went, what? What are you doing? We've never seen that, right? So afterwards, the reaction from the orchestra was, that bastard trying to throw a left curve to us. Like, what is he trying to prove? That was a reaction. And I sort of felt like, yeah, but when it worked, it was really more exciting than Friday, right? So there's a sense orchestras want, what orchestra want is not all the time necessarily the most musical, right? Sometimes another thing about cues, orchestras love cues, right? Because if they don't have to count bars and they can rely consistently on a conductor, hey, there you go, then it makes their job really easy, right? But and I saw this with observing James Levine at Aspen, where he worked on this passage with the violas, and he worked on it so much in rehearsal that by the performance, like, they were able to do without a problem, without a cue. So in the concert, he just went somewhere else totally, and the violas are like, where's our cue, right? Because they were expecting a huge amount of attention in that musical moment, and Levine decided that's working fine. I'm going to take care of something else, and it totally went to somewhere else. And all the violas are like, where's our cue, right? So the point being, it depends what you show the orchestra. Okay. What else, Amy?
I really enjoyed the kind of interactive aspects, like the podcast. I liked that we were able to kind of reach outside of the music to talk to actual people. I also really enjoyed doing the presentation.
Yeah.
Because I'm not much of a really good composer. I came into this class really just to learn more about it, rather than to possibly become one myself, obviously. So being able to engage in those two projects was really interesting and fun for me. And I guess for my suggestions, maybe like more of those, just like smaller scale, because I really enjoyed them and I learned a lot from them.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the podcast, and I'm really glad you're all getting to hear each other's podcast. I think, as I mentioned before, like the interviewing skill, as I learned this semester, I really underestimated the kind of research you need to do to be really fully prepared, right? So I've been doing a lot of deep dive into, like, there's a guy who analyzes Joe Rogan's podcast and going into all kinds of detail of why Joe Rogan is such a good interviewer, right? And these are skills. And actually, my hope for a course like this is not necessarily that you be trained to be a professional conductor, but actually, all the things I learn as a conductor, all the things that make me a better conductor, makes me a better teacher, these are all actually skills that are completely transferable to all of your fields, right? To be a leader, to guide people on a team, to be able to acquire knowledge in an efficient way. So in many ways, I'm really hoping that these translate to a bigger set of use case, right? That it's not somehow such a specific technical skill set that you can only use it for conducting, but that what you're learning from this course is transferable in ways that is useful for you to use in other fields, right? But I agree with you. I think both the podcast and the presentations really top notch. everybody. I think we had some issues of not gauging how long that presentation will take, as in Peter and Yuji's case. But that's just in a way, a sign of how excited both of them got about the subject, and they kind of went in deep, right? So I'm not going to penalize them for that. I would just say be able to gauge how long something will take to present, because that obviously, if you're presenting to your boss or your team leaders or whatever situation it is, something that's supposed to take 12 minutes and it takes 45 minutes, and that's not good. Yeah. Yeah. So you're right. I think I hate talking heads, in a way, me just talking all the time. So what I might, I mean, some of the things I'm thinking about is a lot of the year training modules. I'll maybe set up like a asynchronous video of how to, right? Like for each skill, maybe like a 5-minute video. This is how you practice this, right? So you can refer back to it. And maybe when you practice, you can actually use the video to practice, something like that. So those are set up in advance. But I still have to figure out like how to balance the amount of work done outside, because I've been a student myself. So sometimes when things are scheduled outside of class, it's like, yeah, I'm not going to get that done. So I got to figure out a way in which I can have those year training modules that are sort of set up as an outside thing you can do, and how to keep track of that. Yeah, and in terms of presentations, I think in a course like this, maybe I thought 2 was sort of a good sort of point. So Amy, you're saying it might be good to have maybe one more like smaller presentation type thing earlier in the semester. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily, just like more engaging you to like research and read. Like
Okay.
in music history right now, we do like small writing assignments weekly. I wouldn't say weekly, maybe like once every 2 weeks. I don't know. I just really liked reading about
What do
that
you
kind of
think
stuff.
about the idea of, so, we had different excerpt modules, right? Because I find when I have to teach something, I always go, it helps me learn it better, right? So if I'm sort of a passive participant learning something, it doesn't quite get into my system the way it does when I know I have to teach this particular skill to another person. So what do you think about having mini modules where each student have to teach the excerpt?
Well, definitely, yeah, I think that would definitely be more engaging. And I don't know, prompt you to do more outside of class rather than just sit and listen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, because I
Those
think
setups could be.
go ahead, Alec.
So I think those setups can work really well. They can also be challenging if like the person who's assigned to teach the thing didn't quite get it. Right? It can be really disappointing to be like, oh, this person was supposed to teach me this thing, and
Right.
they're not. Oops.
Yeah. So I'll have to kind of figure out a good balancing point for that. Yeah. But I'm going to say one last thing. It's been such a pleasure to have all of you in this course. You each brought such integrity and seriousness to this craft. And so thank you for that. And I'm reading your feedback to each other on the podcast, and they're so thoughtful, constructive. So it's really wonderful. Yeah. I've really enjoyed this semester working with you. All right. So I will see you Wednesday with Winton Marsalis. Send me those questions after you have seen. You did get my email with those links, yes? Yeah. Okay. All right.
Just one last quick question.
Sure.
Would you recommend us to take this class or if there's another conducting class when we actually have access to
but in a way, it's going to be 4121 is going to be similar, but we're going to go a bit more deeper because the prerequisite is that you had to have finished the theory sequence at Cornell. So but you know, we're going to be doing different pieces. But in a way, it's sort of the way I teach is always cyclical, right? So we always come back to the same concepts. So in some ways, it'll be a repeat, but a second or third cycle in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like maybe even a year or two in the future, when we actually have access to like in-person ensembles.
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
is that
for you guys,
worthwhile?
I would wait until we can be in person, so that you can actually conduct the ensembles. Yeah.
Fantastic. And again, thank you so much for this course. This has been so fun. So fun.
Okay. Good. All right. See you guys on Wednesday.